Well, welcome back. I'm still Jacob Rees-Mogg, and we were discussing counter-extremism. A new report conducted by the research group Pickthall House has documented the views of British Muslims. It has found that most British Muslims identify strongly with Britain, condemn political violence at even higher rates than the general public, but a minority express support for censorship. However, the report recommends emphasising religious liberty and free speech and criticises counter-extremism models for alienating Muslims. Well, I'm now joined by the author of the report, Jacob Williams. Jacob, thank you very much for coming in. What's the main view you take from this report that you've written about how British Muslims have integrated in UK society?
I think the most important thing to emphasise is the need for balance, that the vast majority of British Muslims are patriotic, identify, if anything, more strongly with Britain than the general public, condemn political violence at even higher rates than the general public. But there is a minority who have troubling attitudes to do with censorship, to do with religious values, and hypothetically express support for some kind of authoritarian measures. These are real concerns. They need to be dealt with. But the way to deal with them is actually to ensure British Muslims experience the blessings of liberty, don't feel harassed by the state. We don't have 4-year-olds being reported as potential terrorists for talking about video games and all these things that make Muslims feel besieged and alienated. The right way is actually to ensure that British values are upheld and to restart dialogue with Muslim civil society groups so that we can work together and move towards an even higher level of integration and success.
And the polling was done in areas where there's a high Muslim population.
That's
so
right.
If I understand it correctly, it only included about 60% of the Muslim
That's
population and probably excluded those who are most integrated. Is that...
Yeah,
that's
that
fair?
Is absolutely correct. So even the most concerning findings are probably far less concerning in reality. That's not to say there are no real problems. There are, but most of these surveys that suggest that Muslims believe X, Y, or Z that we might be concerned about focus for logistical reasons and cost reasons on Muslims who are least integrated.
And is there an issue between faith and secular society for Muslims of a fundamental kind? That is to say that Christianity developed a doctrine of there being a separation of powers between the secular and the religious arm at some point in the Middle Ages. But actually, when the Ottoman Empire fell, the head of the Ottoman Empire was both the caliph and the secular ruler, and that Islam doesn't have a concept of that separation of powers.
Well, it's a very interesting question to ask about religious perspectives on politics. I mean, we can look at the long history of anti-Catholic prejudice in Britain, which was often connected to very illiberal positions taken by various popes, right up until the 1960s with Vatican II, with the full-hearted embrace of religious liberty. And part of the great success of Britain, actually, during this period, was that it didn't go and start, for the most part anyway, start thought policing Catholics, tracking people down, saying, hypothetically, do you think the Pope should do X, Y, and Z? That doesn't work. That makes things worse. That produces alienation. And so we have this twin toleration between religion and state.
It had quite a good go at this, actually, but that's
I'm not denying there were problems, yeah.
But there are some views within the Muslim community that are not those of the UK at large. So the figures in relation to Jews, so 53% of male Muslims think the Jews have too much power over the UK government. 4 in 10 say that they have too much power over the UK financial system, and the UK media industry is similar. The anti-Semitism within Islam is a real problem, isn't it?
Well, I would say anti-Semitism among Muslims, this is not something that's endorsed by Islam as a faith. It's a problem of Well,
Muhammad wasn't very keen on Jewish people, to be fair.
Well, this is a very complex historical question that I don't think is going to be
all right, well, let's stick to modern Muslims and their view.
Yes, exactly. So if we look at the actual drivers of this, these conspiratorial attitudes, it's driven by a pathological reaction among a minority of Muslims to this sense that Britain's taken an unbalanced view on questions of the Middle East, an unfair view on domestic policing issues as well. So, yes, there are legitimate concerns here. The right way to go is to enforce the law against actual violence, actual discrimination, actual crime vigorously and impartially, but not to refuse to engage with Muslims or make them feel harassed.
All right, but how do you get across that Hamas, for example, is a terrorist organisation? Only 1 in 4 British Muslims believe Hamas committed murder and rape in Israel on October the 7th.
There's no getting away from the fact that there are problematic conspiratorial attitudes. That's exactly the point. This is very concerning. But we can't deal with these attitudes by saying that therefore we have to go and police Muslims even more strongly. People will say all kind of things that they sympathise with hypothetically without actually endorsing violence.
But isn't this the difficult thing? And to go back to your example of Catholics, that in Northern Ireland, it was Catholics who were members of the IRA. And therefore, inevitably, in trying to stop IRA terrorism, you were more likely to be picking up Catholics than you were to be picking up Protestants.
Sure.
And that inevitably reinforces a sense of alienation, but also it's completely essential because all the figures on terrorism are that MI5's watch list has 43,000 individuals on it, of which 39,000 are Islamist extremists. So although I think your point on the vast bulk of Muslim members of the UK community are peaceful, they may have some views I disagree with, but that's fine in a democratic society, it is nonetheless Islamist terrorism that is the biggest threat to the security of the nation on a day-to-day basis.
It's, of course, a completely fair point to say that an impartial counter-terrorism policy will have a disproportionate number of Muslims relative to their share of the population, right? But the issue is that the counter-terrorism policy, both in this leaked proposal, but also in the existing policy, is not focusing on those who are actually threatening violence, be they Muslim or non-Muslim. It's focusing on those who are non-violent extremists, who are 10-year-olds writing poems about Palestine. Yourself even have been encountered with Prevent. It's a question of focusing on things that don't actually indicate violence. And this idea of this Orwellian notion of pre-crime, that you can predict that someone's going to become a terrorist, doesn't really work.
But can you help further integration in terms of ensuring that people in this country speak English, perhaps in dress or in Sharia courts? Are there more things we can do to underpin the freedoms that everyone else enjoys?
Oh, there absolutely are. I mean, naturally, you've mentioned a few simple common sense examples. I would point out Sharia courts have no legal standing.
No, indeed.
Voluntary tribunals.
Well, but are they really voluntary for the women involved in them? That's, I think, the question. How much implicit coercion is there?
There may well be a significant amount, and where there is, it's vitally important these courts have a duty to inform women of their legal rights.
All right. Well, Jacob, thank you very much for coming on.